feel like I should start this book over and then like put the videos in order on my playlist. My playlist. But kind of too far in now to go backwards and restart. So I'm going to start just where I left off. Failure. I want to know if you can live with failure, yours and mine, and still stand on the edge of the lake and shout to the silver of the full moon, yes. On my 40th birthday, I made a vow. I promised myself that in the second half of my life, I would make only real mistakes. Real mistakes are genuine errors in judgment, choices that can be seen with the knowledge of hindsight, not to have been the best. It's not that I hadn't made lots of real mistakes in my first 40 years, but I was frustrated less with those honest failures born of inexperience or lack of information than with the mistakes I'd made because I'd second-guessed initial judgments. Several years ago, I was asked to co-facilitate an international conference with two women I did not know. I had heard of their work and read a book one of them had authored. During the conference preparations, I had an uneasy feeling which I expressed to both the organizer and the co-leaders. We all worked in very different ways, and we seemed to lack a clear common vision of the conference's purpose and structure. They seemed unconcerned, and I wondered if I should withdraw altogether, but was plagued by doubts. These women were experienced conference facilitators. Surely they would sense if something was not in alignment with our preparations. Perhaps I was just feeling nervous about co-facilitating. I usually worked alone. Maybe I was just reluctant to trust others, or was trying to be in control. Maybe I needed to learn something about working in a team with structure that was more fluid and less predictable than I was used to. It was too late to back out. As 300 people assembled, it quickly became clear just how much we facilitators lacked a common vision. Different participants had arrived with incompatible expectations. With no clear structure, method, or purpose, the other two facilitators and myself were unable to work together to stop the most vocal participants from simply bullying everyone else into following their agenda. My friends and I now refer to this weekend as the Conference from Hell. What is difficult to acknowledge is that I saw this mistake coming and second-guessed myself, went against my own intuitive judgment. It wasn't that I had not seen the truth, I had, but I'd failed to find the courage to act on it. Of course, my intuition can be wrong, but making a wrong decision acting on intuition that is inaccurate is a real mistake, one I can live with more easily than the mistake of failing to act on what, to the best of my ability, I know. Some deny failure, insisting there are no mistakes, but the inability to admit failure robs us of the chance to learn. To learn, we must be willing to make mistakes, and we must be willing to own our mistakes and learn from them. This is hard for those of us who struggle with our perfectionism. I like to learn things that I know I can do well, preferably perfectly and quickly. This unwillingness to make mistakes has stopped me in the past from learning new languages. There is simply no way to learn a language as an adult without making thousands of mistakes that are readily apparent and sometimes very entertaining to those who know the language. This is how we learn, by trying, failing, and receiving correction and trying again. We all have different areas where it is hard for us to let our mistakes be seen. For me, it is languages because I'm attached to my sense of self as intellectually competent. It's just simple self-importance. I hate sounding stupid. However, never having identified myself as someone with athletic ability, I'm fine with learning a physical skill, though I will necessarily make hundreds of mistakes and appear awkward as part of the learning process. When a spiritual teacher nods sagely and says, "There are no mistakes," alluding to a grand design and higher power that is somehow in charge of all of its happening, it's tempting to agree. There are times when a mistake results in a chain of events that lead to wonderful outcomes well beyond those reasonably accepted according to random chance. There are some scientists who assert that the very evolutionary process of creation, from the coincidence of survival-enhancing genetic mutations or mistakes, defies the laws of averages and could not have happened by random chance. I have lived a life full of this sense of unfolding magic and have often felt guided by something larger than myself. Sometimes, through and often despite my mistakes. When I made the mistake of agreeing to go away for the last weekend with a man I did not intend to see again, I was introduced to a friend of his, a wonderful woman who runs a retreat center that became home for my workshops and a personal haven for much of my writing for many years. This does not change the fact that my choice that weekend was a mistake, one that caused great pain for the man I was with and resulted in the loss of opportunity for an ongoing friendship between us. I did feel guided by the magic and mystery of the interconnectedness of life to what became an important relationship and place in my life, but many other decisions I have made have not resulted in the unfolding of clearly fortunate events. And surely the divine, if it does work with purpose in our lives, is not dependent upon, but works through our choices, good and bad. Maintaining that there are no mistakes, that all things work out for the best, assumes a perspective that is wider, deeper, and longer than any to which we as human beings have access. It may well be true, although I cannot see how it could be argued that things work out for the best. For 6 million Jews in World War II, such a position denies or glibly dismisses as necessary the very real and avoidable suffering that happens as a result of human failure. Worse, it suggests that we are not fully responsible for our choices because things are somehow predetermined. While this may be momentarily comforting, we simply have no way of knowing that it is true. I acknowledge that I'm often awed by the mystery that always holds and often guides me. This does not mean that I do not make mistakes, that I cannot fail. Refusing to acknowledge failure is often an attempt to avoid the paralysis of shame. Many of us were raised or educated by people who tried to make us feel guilty when we made a mistake, hoping that the fear of being shamed would help us avoid failure. It didn't. It didn't work. We cannot live fully and avoid mistakes. So to avoid the paralysis and pain of shame, we now narrow our lives to those things we already know and deny the mistakes that happen. I was amazed to find how deeply rooted in me this fear of shame and failure. When my elder son Brendan was having difficulty in high school, going to the library to read instead of attending classes because he was bored. You see, I want you to know I didn't fail to have a brilliant child. I just failed to have one who could endure the plodding rigors of the public school system. I was amazed at the terror I felt when it became apparent that he might fail a grade. All the nightmare associations from my school days came to the fore. People who fail a grade drop out, are unemployable, and die on the streets. Those who fail a grade are marked for life as lacking, unworthy, unacceptable, shamed. It is amazing how strong these fears are within me, even though I can now see that they are unfounded. How many times since you have become an adult has someone asked you what mark you received in ninth grade geography? Even now, when I'm anxious about something, anything, the most common dream I have is being back in school. About to take an exam as I realize that I have not attended classes or studied. This despite the fact that I have never come close to failing an exam in my life, and there was my son, not attending classes or studying, living out my worst nightmare. When I tell others about my fear of failure, my own as a mother or my son's in school, I learn things I have not known about those close to me. One friend tells me she never got her degree because she just could not pass its statistics course. Another, as a young woman, had been pushed to perform music in front of an audience and was mortified when she wet her pants on stage. One after the other, people I respect and admire share their stories of failure with me. Amazingly, many of the most competent and caring adults I know failed or quit high school. When we cannot live with failure, we limit the intimacy in our lives. People do not tell stories of failure to those who have room in their hearts for only perfection. Tell me a story of failure in your life, a time when you made a mistake. Tell it with compassion for the child or man or woman you were. Tell it with ruthless honesty and gentle acceptance. We do not avoid shame by hiding mistakes. The shame just becomes buried within us. Shame releases its paralyzing grip on us when we take responsibility for our mistakes, and sometimes serious consequences for those mistakes can have for ourselves and others. This way, shame can be our ally, pointing to things we have not accepted about ourselves, guiding us to mistakes that we have not acknowledged, and accepting our failings means accepting where we have hurt others or ourselves, and making restitution for these injuries where it is possible. Accepting responsibilities without falling into shame or blame is a tricky business. My failure to see and accept my physical limitations resulted in a long and debilitating illness. I burned out my immune system with too much doing, working, trying, and worrying. For years, I fought this knowledge and consequently continued to make the mistakes that perpetuated the illness. It seemed easier for me to deal with the frustration and pain of illness than to take responsibility for my own mistakes. It was not until I was willing to look at what was without judgment that I could risk seeing and therefore be able to stop repeating my mistakes. I realized that while I'm very good at estimating how much time it takes to do something, which is why I'm seldom late, I'm very bad at evaluating how much energy it takes to do something. If I can fit it into a time schedule, I think I can do it. After years of trying to change my inability, because I saw it as a moral failure not to be able to evaluate how much I could do, I now accept this about myself and compensate for it. I plan what I'm going to do, and knowing I have a kind of perpetual handicap about what my body, mind, and heart can accomplish at any given time, I arbitrarily reduce my plans by 30 to 50%, or I run them by friends who have a much better sense of what is humanly possible, and I take their advice. I live with the consequences of failing to recognize my mistakes for years. My health is good, but my immune system is less than robust after so many years of being burned out. It may never fully recover. And of course, there are factors that affect my health over which I have no immediate control: genetics, the quality of air and the water I take in, the presence of infectious diseases around me. I was not the only one to feel the consequences of my failure to accept my physical limitations. My lack of energy and frequent illness have profoundly affected my children. It is hard to live with the knowledge of how our mistakes affect those we love, particularly those who are dependent on us, who do not have a choice to walk away from us. The mistakes I have made with my sons, the failures of mothering, are the hardest to live with. When someone tells me how wonderful these two young men are, I remember all the times I've shouted at them for unimportant things, all the times I've failed to be there with them fully. They are wonderful young men, but knowing how many mistakes I have made, I am sure they are wonderful not because, but in spite of my mistakes. But the question is, can I live with my failures and still say yes to life? Still feel I deserve and am able to receive the beauty that is around me, including the beauty in the men my sons have become. Forgiveness happens with time as we learn to live with what cannot be changed. The capacity to live with what is hard within us, and when we can live consciously with the knowledge of what we or others have done, we are freed from the constant, if unconscious effort of trying to pull away from what is. Trying to deny the mistakes that we have made is like trying not to let your skin touch the cloth of a cold wet jacket you are wearing. Impossible and exhausting in the trying. We are afraid that our failures will mean that we will not be loved. We don't earn love. How we treat others does, of course, affect our relationships. I do not want to be near the man who beat me. I do not trust the friend who has repeatedly lied to me. But we are loved for who we are, not what we do. Love is larger than what we do. Love moves through us if we let it. One day, I realized that I could love someone and still decide to separate myself from them if our behavior together was repeatedly damaging to each other. I did not have to try to stop loving him. And if I love another for who she is, not because she earns my love with her actions, then the same must also be true for those who love me. This isn't a license to treat those who love us badly, but it helps us step off the endless treadmill of doing for others, trying to be what we think they want us to be in an attempt to earn their love. It doesn't work. We can't earn love. At the end of the day, the failure I find the hardest to live with is the one that I made because I lacked the courage to let love take me where it will. And this mistake cannot be corrected by trying harder. It requires that I surrender to that which is larger than myself, that I be willing to move ahead where I'm afraid of making mistakes. It requires telling the truth about my worst failures and saying, when I have no faith that anyone or anything is listening, I don't know how to live with this, how to forgive myself. I cannot do this with my will. Help me. In this place, I sit and wait for love to find me, to come and take me home to the place where I, mistakes included, will be welcomed. And that was failure. The commitment's next.